My question is, just so we get an understanding of Islam, what is the origin of Islam? What influenced Muhammad that brought forth his religion?
Yeah, so there's actually two things here that should be said. There's what we call the standard narrative.
Yep.
And something else. So first, let me explain the standard narrative. The standard narrative is what the Muslim sources claim. The Muslim sources claim that there was a man named Muhammad from the Quraysh tribe in Arabia, in Mecca, and he came from a pagan family, but around them there were a lot of Jewish tribes and to a lesser extent also some Christians, especially to the south. This man was sort of vexed by the lackluster character of the religion that he was born into compared to what Jews and Christians had. So, for example, the Arabs had traditions from their fathers that seemed to come from the murky past. What do we really have to give us confidence that these things are reliable and so forth? And the Jews were merciless in their mockery of pagan idolatry. And this comes from the prophets. If you look at Isaiah or the other prophets, they lambast polytheism and idolatry to the bitter end. It's not a pretty picture. Isaiah talks about the idolaters sawing down a tree in the forest, cutting it in half, and with one half they're putting it in the fire to roast their food. So the same thing they make their god out of is used as fuel for the fire, and then they're crafting this other part into a god, and they're making it, and then they're bowing down to it and saying, "You made me." So what they made, they bow down to and say. So they were merciless, and they were very good at it. And this sort of humiliated Muhammad. At the same time, the Jews were talking about a figure who's going to come in the future, who's going to aid them. Now, we recognize that what they're thinking is the Messiah is still in the future. He's not yet come. And Muhammad is growing up in this context, and he begins to think, maybe it's me. Maybe I'm that figure. And in 610, so 40 years after he was born in 570, he goes to a dark, dank cave outside of Mecca, and he encounters a being that tells him, recite. Now, when they translate this, it sometimes says read, but it's better understood as recite. This being tells him to recite, and he says, I can't recite. Now, that sounds strange to us, but you have to understand, in his context, the pagans were known, certainly a certain group of them, were as poets who were possessed by the desert jinn, demons in our parlance. And these people excelled in eloquence and in poetry, but they did so because they were inhabited by these demons. And Muhammad despised them. He idolized the Christians and the Jews. And so he didn't like the idea of being one of these people, but he thought the spirit that was accosting him was the beginning of this sort of thing in his case, as it had been in the case of others. And so he says, I can't recite. I'm not a reciter. And this being grabs him around the chest and throat and begins to squeeze him until it felt like the life was going out of him, shakes him like a rag doll, and he collapses to the ground. And then once he regains his composure, he gets back up, and the being says to him, recite. He says, I can't. And the being does it again, manhandles him. It's like a UFC competition or something, and he falls to the ground like a rag doll, and he gets back up, and the being says it to him again, and finally he succumbs to it, and the being disappears, and Muhammad runs from the cave, and he says, woe is me, poet or possessed. He thinks he's possessed on this occasion, and he says, never will it be said of me by the Quraysh that he is a poet. He doesn't want his tribe to think of him that way, so he wants to throw himself off the precipice of the mountains. And he goes up on various occasions to do this, to commit suicide. How many of you have read the Bible where this is the way the prophets react to their calling as prophets? Never, right? It never happens. The angels don't slap them around and choke them around the throat and lead them to want to commit suicide thinking they're possessed. Well, in the Quran, if you read it over and over again, Muhammad has Allah saying to him as a comfort to him, you're not possessed, you're not possessed, you're not possessed, you're not possessed. Eventually, you have to start wondering why this is an obsession of Muhammad. He needs constant reassurance that he's not possessed. It's like in Macbeth, methinks the lady doth protest too much. Muhammad constantly is plagued by this idea that he's possessed, even throughout his prophetic career. And there are many other things that go with this. When Muhammad gets his revelations, he falls down to the ground, he flops around, he foams at the mouth, his eyes roll back in his head, he hears ringing in his ears, the buzzing of bees. It doesn't sound like the biblical experience of a prophet. So that's just some idea of where this originates. Muhammad eventually comes to proclaim himself the long-expected figure that was to come, and he's trying to get Jews and Christians to follow him. When that doesn't happen, he turns on the Jews. He begins to wipe out Jewish tribes. He wiped out one tribe, 800 men cut off their heads at one time, and things like that happened. Eventually, the story is a Jewish woman poisoned the food that he was eating, and there's dispute about it all. But in any case, over 23 years, he begins to deny every single Christian doctrine you can think of, hates the Jews, hates the Christians, and eventually says to subjugate the world to his God. So that's the standard narrative. But for all that, there's a lot to be said against whether we can really take these accounts as credible. J. Smith is really the guy for that. J. Smith has been blowing holes in this. It's not my field of expertise. It's always been in the Islamic sources. I just take their narratives and say, okay, here's what your narrative says. Seems to me like good reason not to believe in him. Jay comes along and says, "There's nobody to believe in," right? So,
yeah, that's true.
Listen to Jay. He's the guy on the historical questions. Can we trust these sources?
Yeah, and I think it's I. By the way, it's interesting. I spend a lot of time now focusing on Jay's narrative in that the Muhammad that everybody says is the Muhammad of Islam, believe it or not, didn't even exist. Like the Muhammad of Islam wasn't even around. And there's so much of this. By the way, thinking of the geopolitical aspect of all of this, which I think is really important to discuss for a second. If you look at the behavior of MBS right now in Saudi Arabia, he is very clearly beginning to pick up on a lot of the research that's coming from further east of the Arabian Peninsula. The really smart researchers that are looking at Islam right now are actually questioning these so-called original manuscripts and realizing that the Quran that they say actually existed and came from those sources don't exist. And they're also beginning to lay down some groundwork on some of the very recent research that's coming out about the existence of Muhammad and just a lot of avenues that people didn't even pursue. So I think he recognizes this, which is why his focus on Jerusalem is beginning to wane. He's beginning to minimize the value of Jerusalem as a city to Saudi Arabia. And he's also spending a lot more time focusing on a normalization effort with Israel, because he knows that the only way they're going to be able to obtain a significant standing within Saudi Arabia in the Middle Eastern world and go from the G20 to the G7 is by creating these normalization agreements, because it's the only path to change the trade routes that he needs to change. He's already got Egypt already tied up with the compensating for the loss of the use of the Suez Canal. The Red Sea is becoming less and less consequential. People are beginning to recognize that the Red Sea is not viable for some of the modern ships that are wanting to go through that channel, especially with what's happening with the Yemeni Houthis. And so a lot of this research is coming out more and more and more, and it's getting to the attention of the royal family of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and they're beginning to realize that the only way they're going to be able to effectively deal with it is by minimizing it and allowing it to become a little bit more of a secularized nation, which is something I never thought I would see happen with Saudi Arabia, but it would appear to be the case right now. So that second narrative that he's talking about is a pretty significant one, by the way, one that we probably shouldn't be ignoring, because there's a lot that's to be said about it.